What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Vergil Ortiz Jr., 18 wins and 0 losses, taking on Michael McKinson, 22 wins and 0 losses. This is a battle of undefeateds, but not all undefeateds are equal in the sense that Vergil Ortiz Jr. is looked at as being one of the most promising young talents in all of boxing. He's still only 24 years old. Out of his 18 wins, all 18 have come via knockout. He is yet to be taken the distance. And he's participating in one of the best divisions in boxing, welterweight 147, although some feel like it's only a matter of time before he goes up to 154. And he is basically in that next crop because hopefully they make Errol Spence Jr. versus Terence Crawford. We're all hoping, right, for all of the belts at welterweight, one of the best fights that could be made in recent memory in any division. Well, whenever that's settled and the smoke clears, a lot of people suspect that there are going to be a few belts that are just kind of hanging in the balance and will be available in vacant fights for those titles. So whoever wins between Spence and Crawford probably won't handle all of the sanctioning body mandated mandatory fights and will instead relinquish one or more of the belts. And so that is where I could see Vergil Ortiz Jr. getting a shot because he's been one of the mandatories, as has the other most highly touted prospect turned contender in the division, Jerron Boots Ennis. You often hear those two, Ennis and Vergil Ortiz, kind of mentioned together or measured together, people kind of hypothesizing like who would win in this battle of, young prospect turned contenders. I actually ran a poll on this. Most felt Boots would win, even though there was a pretty solid percentage, maybe 30-something% might have said Vergil Ortiz Jr. So yeah, Vergil Ortiz Jr. looks super promising, such a ferocious puncher. And the thing is, as hard as he punches, and again, he's a violent puncher, it's his jab that might be his most valuable punch in his arsenal. He does go to the body devastatingly, but his jab is beautiful, it's pummeling, and he uses it in a well-timed but still consistent way. Very good jab. In fact, another one of the top prospects, or should I say prospect turned contenders at welterweight, just on the outside of that top tier in the division, there's basically Spence and Crawford, and then there's everyone else, right? Since Manny Pacquiao retired, since Keith Thurman isn't what he used to be, Danny Garcia went up a division, Sean Porter recently retired. But basically, outside of Spence and Crawford, you then have, Boots Ennis and Vergil Ortiz Jr. You also have Yordenis Ugas, who picked up that win against Manny Pacquiao and, recently got stopped by Errol Spence Jr. But yeah, outside of Boots Ennis and then Vergil Ortiz Jr., you then have like Stanionis, who also has an outstanding jab. We recently saw Stanionis beat Butayev, another very good fighter. But yeah, Vergil Ortiz Jr., I remember when he first made a huge impression on me was when I saw him fight Mauricio Herrera, a sweet science style fighter who was well out of his prime. So this isn't the same Mauricio Herrera who most felt with their own two eyes and saw outbox Danny Garcia. No, this was more or less a shell of that Mauricio Herrera. But the way that Vergil Ortiz Jr. just devastated Herrera and knocked him out in the third round had a lot of people say, well, damn. But even before that, they were building him up. He's a Golden Boy fighter. So when Canelo was still on Golden Boy, down on the undercards of, the two Canelo versus Triple G fights, Vergil Ortiz Jr. was fighting Cesar Valenzuela and Roberto Ortiz, basically lesser named fighters that were meant to kind of build his or increase his stature, make him look impressive in these undercards. But yeah, from the point that he started fighting Mauricio Herrera onward, you started seeing the level of opponent quality start to heighten little by little to where he was stopping. And I mean, he stopped everybody, but Antonio Orozco in the 6th round, Brad Solomon, kind of a sweet science guy and formerly a highly touted prospect himself, stopped Brad Solomon in the 5th round, Samuel Vargas in the 7th round. I was actually surprised Samuel Vargas made it 7 rounds against Ortiz. I mean, Samuel Vargas after that got stopped, obliterated in the 1st round against Conor Benn. But yeah, after Samuel Vargas, then we saw Vergil Ortiz have 2 significant step-up fights. First against former 140-pound belt holder who lost his title to another Robert Garcia trained fighter, Vergil Ortiz Jr. used to be trained by Robert Garcia until his last fight against Mean Machine Kavaliauskas, which I guess he was still technically trained by Robert Garcia, but Robert Garcia wasn't in his corner for that fight. But Vergil Ortiz Jr. is now being trained by Manny Robles. That's Andy Ruiz's former trainer. But Vergil Ortiz Jr., like the guy who first beat Maurice Hooker, that being Jose Ramirez, were both trained by Robert Garcia around that same time. So Maurice Hooker fought pretty competitively with Vergil Ortiz Jr., kind of lit him up a few times in the early rounds, but little by little, Vergil Ortiz Jr. started launching that heavy jab attack, closing the distance because Maurice Hooker had the reach advantage, a very long fighter. But Vergil Ortiz Jr. is a pretty tall fighter himself. He's 5'10", got a 72-inch reach, so he has the same reach as Errol Spence Jr. Vergil Ortiz Jr. started closing the distance against Maurice Hooker, started just letting his hands go to the body, ended up dropping him, I believe, in the 6th round, and then finishing him in the 7th round, where I really have reservations in terms of how good Maurice Hooker could eventually be at welterweight. It just doesn't seem like his body and chin are durable enough to sustain the tougher fights against the, obviously, we don't know how good Vergil Ortiz Jr. could be, but he definitely seems to be one of the more devastating and destructive fighters in and around his weight class. So Maurice Hooker, like he broke down in the 5th round against Jose Ramirez, also started to break down in the 5th, 6th round against Vergil Ortiz Jr., got stopped in the 7th, although he also sustained either an arm, I think it was an arm or hand injury. So he went down for a second time, didn't get up. He was injured as well, so they stopped the fight. But it was a clean TKO victory for Vergil Ortiz Jr. And then he had another step-up fight, this time against Edges Mean Machine Kavaliauskas. This is the guy who blasted Terence Crawford. Most feel that should have been ruled a knockdown in the 2nd or 3rd round against Crawford. Hurt him multiple times. Crawford was getting hit by that straight right hand because Crawford was fighting mostly from the southpaw stance. So you had Mean Machine throwing right hand leads and catching Crawford cleanly several times, to where Crawford basically threw the whole boxing handbook out of the window and kind of went toe to toe. Not too recklessly, but basically was just trying to get him the hell out of there at a certain point, to where Andre Ward on the broadcast was saying, I don't know if this is the style of fight Crawford should be fighting this guy with. We see that this guy's a super heavy hitter. Well, Crawford ended up knocking Mean Machine out in devastating fashion. And when Vergil Ortiz fought Mean Machine also in the 2nd round hurt Vergil Ortiz pretty badly. First with an uppercut, where Vergil Ortiz clearly didn't see the punch, got caught cleanly with the uppercut, and then he got caught with 2 or 3 more uppercuts, because once Mean Machine saw that Vergil Ortiz was hurt, he tried to end the fight right there, hit him 3 or 4 times very hard, and actually hurt him again towards the end of that round. And when he first hurt him with those few uppercuts and with a couple hooks to the side of the head, Vergil Ortiz was trying to violently punch back, blasting him to the body, but he was then getting caught time and time again in those next few seconds, to where he was so badly hurt that his legs were such that he threw a wild punch, missed, and fell down. A lot of people felt that that should have been called a knockdown. It wasn't, to me, as clear a knockdown as Mean Machine's near knockdown was of Terence Crawford, but I still think that that one against Vergil Ortiz, even though he did lose his balance by whiffing on a punch, he was so off balance because the punches that he got caught cleanly with threw him off balance. Well, when he got hurt again, he got hurt for the first time badly in the 2nd round. He got drilled and hurt again, this time by right hands in the 3rd round, and again, a couple hooks as well. When Mean Machine rifles you, he'll try to follow it up quickly with some more power punches. And again, early in fights, Mean Machine is very, very, very dangerous. But within seconds of hurting Vergil Ortiz, in the next round, in that 3rd round, Ortiz basically took that as a direct challenge and said, oh, hell no. Started launching devastating, scooping, vicious punches to the body, where you could see Mean Machine's posture and his body language switch up like that. And then shortly after that, he got nailed with a straight right hand, dropped on his butt in the closing seconds of the 3rd round. And from that point on, more or less, Vergil Ortiz started to control the fight. He turned that thing around quickly. Again, he got hurt in the 2nd, hurt again in the 3rd, then dropped Mean Machine in the 3rd round and proceeded to pretty much win the next few rounds, largely behind that very educated jab and ended up finishing Mean Machine in the 8th round, knocked him down multiple times after that and stopped him in the 8th round. That to me was Vergil Ortiz Jr.'s most impressive win to date. And now he's about to fight Michael McKinson, kind of a under the radar fighter from the UK. Those in the UK, a lot of people know about him there, but he has still been fighting more or less in the regional scene. He's won some of those like kind of lesser belts, European belts, silver international belts, and so forth. He hasn't beaten anybody with the Wikipedia page yet. He's trained by his dad. He is undefeated. He's a southpaw, which is something worth noting because you know, Vergil Ortiz in his last several fights hasn't fought a southpaw in quite some time. You'd have to go like 7, 8 fights back when he was fighting Jesus Badian. That was the last time Vergil Ortiz fought a southpaw. So it's been some time. And Michael McKinson, kind of a slick fighter, pretty good defensively. He fights a lot on his back foot. So he's one of those guys who will wait, and then find his opportunities to throw that left hand. He wants to catch you cleanly. And one thing about Michael McKinson, he's got several first round knockdowns, but he only has 2 knockouts of his career. Like out of his 22 wins, only 2 have come via knockout. But like, I don't think he knocked Alex Martin down, but in his 3 fights before that, against Ranowski, against Chris Congo, and against Martin Harkin, he knocked all 3 of them down in the first round. But all 3 of those guys ended up making it the distance. Like, he hasn't scored a knockout since like 2017. That's like 10 fights ago. He's been winning like almost all of his fights via unanimous decision, but like not split decision. These aren't like, oh, 115, 113. No, he's pretty much winning by wide margins, but it's all going the distance. So what do I expect between Vergil Ortiz Jr. and Mikey? They call him Mikey McKinson. Well, you've got one guy who's got some of the hardest punches in the division in Vergil Ortiz Jr. And then you've got one of the guys with one of the lowest knockout percentages in the division in Mikey McKinson, against southpaw. That might make things a little bit interesting, especially early, but the punching power isn't there. Vergil Ortiz Jr. also has like a slight height advantage over McKinson, as well as a slight reach advantage. It's 72 inches to 70 inches. So he's got slight advantages in both of those. Plus, he's just a much more devastating puncher. And, you know, Mikey McKinson, I think he's going to catch Vergil Ortiz with a few of those right hands early. I think he's going to throw stuff right up the middle, and it's going to be like taking a step back, moving. Even though I think Vergil Ortiz has been doing his homework, and you know, he's a very intelligent kid. You know, like he plays guitar, he studies boxing. He's a very interesting person, but I think that he's at least watched enough of McKinson's fights to know that McKinson scores some early knockdowns. So I don't think Ortiz wants to be one of those guys who gets put on their butt in the first round against McKinson. So I think he's going to be cognizant of that. So he might start off a little patient just to make sure that he doesn't walk into something that's from an angle that he hasn't seen in a while, with some speed and with a trajectory that he hasn't seen. Mikey McKinson's style is a little bit weird. Like, he'll throw kind of a fast, like with his lead hand, he'll throw kind of like a sweeping hook, and it's sort of a check hook, but he'll throw something in your face to kind of blind you to put a left hand behind it. And he does it kind of in a, you know, episodic or ambush style, to borrow a couple terms from online boxing analyst Richard Dwyer. You know, kind of an ambush style with the way he deploys some of his left hands. And he's hard to land flush against, because when you do collapse the pocket against him, or when he's collapsing the pocket against you, he'll usually tie up pretty quickly, so he's not letting you do a ton of work on the inside. Or he'll tie up for a second, then let a couple sneaky quick punches go, and then break. He's somebody who's kind of tough to get a beat on, especially in the early rounds. This might become a little bit more predictable as we get into the middle rounds, but when you're fighting a southpaw, what's the conventional wisdom? Right hand leads, right? You don't want to get hit by the straight left hand from the southpaw, and you want to counter that by throwing right hand leads to give the lefty something to think about. So Vergil Ortiz being so jab heavy, you wonder if McKinson's left hand is going to cause Ortiz to keep that jab in his holster just a little bit more than he normally does. I don't think that's going to be the case, though. I think he's going to be able to deploy the jab once he kind of finds out how to get away from getting hit by straight left hands, whether that means that he's going to be throwing right hand leads to the body, because, again, Besides the jab, Vergil Ortiz's work to the body is one of the key ingredients that make for his winning recipe. So I think that the work to the body, as Vergil Ortiz, the patient hunter, is going to be trying to catch, corner, the kind of like sly fox. It's going to be a little cat and mouse here, I think. But I think that the work to the body is going to be what slows McKinson down in the middle rounds. And then I think he's going to start getting pummeled more and more to where I expect the devastatingly ferocious Vergil Ortiz Jr. to score a late round knockout of McKinson. So not only do I think he's going to give McKinson his first loss, but I think it's going to come via stoppage in the late rounds. Again, I think that McKinson is going to have some interesting moments early. I don't think he's going to necessarily drop Ortiz. He doesn't hit anywhere nearly as hard, for instance, as Mean Machine Kavaliauskas. But even if the guy doesn't hit super hard, if you're getting caught cleanly with a punch from a professional fighter who knows how to catch you with a certain timing that you weren't expecting, you can get rattled or even dropped. So yeah, I think Vergil Ortiz is going to have some interesting moments, and he's going to have to kind of figure McKinson out. But I expect him to do so, and once he does so, I think he's going to take full control. And McKinson, again, he's a sly fox, but you know, I look at this as being almost as big a mismatch as like when they announced that Jaime Munguia was going to fight Demetrius Ballard. Kind of one of those, what? Like, you don't, with somebody as talented as Vergil Ortiz Jr., you don't want him fighting these fights against somebody as unknown as Michael McKinson. Even though, again, I think that this is going to be a little bit of an interesting style matchup for multiple reasons. But it's just like Ortiz is just too good to be wasting these young years. Again, he has had a couple interesting step-up opponents. Like, I wasn't mad when he was fighting Mean Machine. I'm like, damn, this is a true step-up, and it's going to be a real test for Ortiz, which it turned out to be a real test for Ortiz. One that he passed with flying colors at the end of the day. But McKinson isn't nearly as dangerous as Mean Machine, and I just hope that if Vergil Ortiz Jr. does, in fact, pass this test and beat Michael McKinson, which, again, I'm going to go with a late stoppage here. We're talking maybe 9th or 10th round type of stoppage. I just wonder how Golden Boy is going to match make for Vergil Ortiz Jr. You know, I was talking about a little bit about this in my last live chat, just how we should look at these divisions, how we should look at boxing as a whole when we size up the talent in each one of these divisions. I think I might have been talking about this a little bit in the Gary Antoine Russell versus Francis Barthélemy preview as well. But we just look at the top tier talent in any division, and we start just imagining what matchups we might see in the near future. You could throw half of those matchups out of the window if those guys aren't in the same promotional outfit, if they're not fighting on the same network. And the fact that Vergil Ortiz Jr. is 147 and might soon go to 154, well, what do we know about 147 and 154 in the political realm of boxing? PBC has the lion's share of the talent in both of those divisions. They have like 80-90% of the top tier talent and the most widely known talent in both of those divisions. So Oscar De La Hoya, I just hope we don't get those matchups that look like they could happen. Like, for instance, if there's going to be like a vacant shot, or even if the winner of Spence versus Crawford keeps the titles and takes on a #1 contender in Boots Ennis, or in some cases, depending on which belt we're talking about, Vergil Ortiz Jr. If they were going to agree to fight Ortiz, but Golden Boy doesn't give the blessing and instead kind of pulls a move like he did with the potential matchup between WBC middleweight champion Jermall Charlo and his guy Jaime Munguia, where he said, no, if the zone isn't involved, the match isn't happening, which ended up kind of shattering that potential fight. Like, you have to at least be self-aware. I understand that it's a business, and I understand Oscar is not going to, like, you know, take Ryan Garcia away from the zone to make the match with Gervonta Davis. That's why I'm very skeptical of that match being made. It's going to require a cross-promotional effort, and you hear both sides already kind of negotiating leverage in public. But when it comes to Vergil Ortiz Jr. going forward, I feel like Golden Boy is going to have to make some concessions. Like, Vergil Ortiz might have to fight on Showtime to fight in a fight that truly matters. Or you can even have a DAZN-based fight if Eddie Hearn were to give his blessing and to have Vergil Ortiz Jr. fight Conor Benn, which I think very highly of Conor Benn. but I don't think that Eddie Hearn is going to put Conor Benn in the ring with Vergil Ortiz Jr. just yet. You know, I don't think that's going to happen. But, you know, if it's not going to be a cross-promotional effort for Vergil Ortiz Jr., what are they going to do over there at Golden Boy? Like, this is where you have to start getting really creative. Like when, you know, Bob Arum was matchmaking for Terence Crawford on Top Rank, where he was putting him in with like Amir Khan and Jose Benavidez Jr. and eventually Kell Brook. Like, these weren't necessarily the matches that we wanted to see Terence Crawford in. Or how PBC's had to manage, or Mayweather Promotions has had to manage Gervonta, or chosen to manage Gervonta Davis's career, where if you're not going to be making cross-promotional efforts to fight the, you know, Devin Haney's and Teofimo Lopez's, Vasily Lomachenko's, and all those guys, well, what are you going to do then? Well, let's fight Mario Barrios up at 140. Let's fight Leo Santa Cruz and make him fight in a division where he's not at his best. I know he had a fight at 130 before, but Leo Santa Cruz was always like a 118 to 126 guy. So I don't like when these promoters have to get super creative to matchmake for guys that they are unwilling to make cross-promotional concessions in their matchmaking with. So it's going to be worth a watch, and keep a close eye on what Golden Boy chooses to do going forward with Vergil Ortiz Jr. I almost suspect that at some point, I don't know how many more fights Vergil Ortiz Jr. has with Golden Boy in his contract, but it's like, if you want to take your career into your own hands, you might have to just do what you need to do and go to where the fighters that matter are, if you want to fight in the fights that matter. And that's if you've already gone to your promoter and say, no, get me this guy, and do whatever you have to do to make this fight or this fight or this fight happen. Like, I would love to see Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Stanionis. I mean, come on. Like, who wouldn't want to see that fight? Or against Bout's Ennis, obviously, like, or against Butayev. But in any one of these scenarios, cross-promotional efforts have to be made. And, you know, I don't see Oscar putting his other quality fighter at 147, Alexi Rocha. I don't see him doing Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Rocha. So, yeah, it's going to be worth seeing what move Oscar makes with the ultra-talented Vergil Ortiz Jr. But yeah, let me know what you think about Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Michael McKinson. What do you expect to see going forward for Ortiz? Do you think he's going to leave Golden Boy to go over to PBC necessarily to fight some of those other elite 147 guys? Or do you think Golden Boy is going to break bread essentially and do what you have to do to make cross-promotional fights with those elite fighters at 147? Let me know what you think in the comments, and please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.